Hello and welcome. I'm Sheila Grube, and this is my 50 States ZenQuiltz journey. Every state will be coming out on my YouTube channel every Sunday, so be sure to like and subscribe so you get those notifications every week as they come in. Here is a visual of all of the tools that were on that supply list in the beginning of the recording. So I'm just going to go ahead and push these aside and we'll get started. So to begin with, I'm going to set up my tile using a ruler and measuring out my division for my quilt. So in my large scale class, all of these divisions were separate tiles or pieces of paper. So we're going to create the visual now just with our 3.5-inch tile and a ruler to break that space apart. So I'm going to just measure 3/16 of an inch on either side of that tile. So 3/16, just add a little hash mark there. And this is just going to create our tile's edge or a frame around this block. So each one of these, I'm going to go right to the tile's edge, connecting those lines from side to side, or connecting those hash marks side to side, creating these little square, or I guess maybe triangular, spaces in the corner of the tile. So now that I have that border created, I'm going to go ahead and measure the center of that border. So it would be 1.5 and 1 hash mark. And again, 1.5 and 1 hash mark. Okay. So now that we have that hash mark, we're not going to connect those. We're going to use those as our guideline to create a 1/2-inch band that goes down the center of this tile. So I'm going to hold my ruler. I'm going to hold my ruler so that that hash mark we just created is at 1/4 of an inch. Okay. And then I'm going to add another hash mark at the first line on my ruler and a 1/2 inch. So I'm going to include 1/4 inch on either side of that center hash to create this 1/2 inch. And now I'm going to go ahead and connect those lines or those hash marks, just the two that we just created. So that 1/2 inch space, we're going to ignore that. We're going to ignore that center hash and we're going to go right up to the 1/2 inch mark and add another line. So we're going to inevitably have a channel that goes down the center of our tile that's 1/2 an inch wide. And now I'm going to do the same thing to that other hash mark that we laid down, and 1/4 inch to the left, that very first line, I'm going to add a hash mark, and 1/4 inch to the right, add another hash mark. So now that we have those 3 lines, we're going to use those new hash marks that we've just created to add a line that goes behind that original channel that we've just created a moment ago. So we're going to use our go behind and create a channel that goes behind using these 1/2 inch hash marks that we've just created. Now I'm just going to go ahead and erase those hash marks on the center. And we have this kind of go behind plus sign. Yeah. All right. So now that we have this, we're going to do a diagonal line from the bottom left corner of each of these blocks to the top right corner. So bottom left corner to top right corner, just adding a diagonal line. You want to do that in each of those 4 boxes. So once we have that diagonal line from our bottom left to top right corner in each one of those boxes, so now that we have our diagonal line from the bottom left to the top right, we're going to go ahead and create a 1/2 inch little hash mark on the left and bottom of each one of those boxes. So just a little hash mark on the left line and the bottom line of each one of those boxes. Turning your tile so that your diagonal line is always going from the bottom left to the top right in the direction that it was drawn. And now that we have those hash marks, we're going to draw a straight line connecting those 1/2 inch marks to our diagonal line. So we're just going to go ahead and extend those hash marks right out to our diagonal lines on either side until we meet that diagonal line. And we're going to inevitably end up with these small little 1/2 inch squares in the bottom corner of each one of those boxes that we've created. So using our go behind and stopping when we get to that channel in the center of our tile, just connecting those 1/2 inches right to that diagonal line. So we have these 4 small boxes that are resting in these larger boxes with a diagonal line that goes right through the center. Okay. So now we're going to go to these outside lines, our frame lines that we've created, and we're going to measure from the top of that line down a 1/2 inch. And we're going to do that on every box. So every box on the frame line, on both sides of the frame line, are going to get a 1/2 inch hash mark right on that frame line. So once we get through setting up all of these pieces, our um, quilt pieces, that's when the fun begins, right? Right now, just visualize each one of these pieces that we're putting together, a piece of material, or each one of these measurements, I should say, that we're putting together is a piece of material that is inevitably going to be forming our quilt, right? All right. So now that we have little hash marks a 1/2 inch from the corner of each box on the outside of the frame, we're going to connect those hash marks to the corners of these smaller boxes. So a diagonal from the corner of our small box up to that 1/2 inch hash mark. So each corner of the box is going to connect to that hash mark. So this is what we're going to end up with in each box. So we're all set to begin adding our color now. So these individual little pieces are our pieces of fabric that we have put together to create our quilt block. So each one of those pieces I'm going to define as a different color. And if you're following along on the series, I'm always going to have some kind of common element that's inevitably going to tie all 50 states together visually, so that they have some kind of coherency as we finish up this process. All right. So to begin with, I'm going to start with that 991. And once again, I'm going to use my blender, my palette, I should say, and I just have a dollar store disposable, sheet of paper palette with, you can use wax paper, saran wrap, anything that is non-porous so that you can add your color onto this palette and in turn use your blender to pick up the color rather than going directly to your tile with marker. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and just pick up a palette of that beautiful yellow color and just start blending this around. And as I do that, once I kind of define my outline, I'm going to use a circular motion to kind of blend this all together and kind of create a texture into this fabric. Um, I like the texture that the blender offers as opposed to that direct marker to paper um, outcome. But if you'd rather just go right to your tile with your marker, by all means, that's perfect. Or if you're using watercolor or colored pencil for this process, there's no right or wrong, right? We're just having fun. We're using our creative juices and exploring the 50 states together. So there's no shoulds in any of this. Anytime your creative voice is speaking to you, listen to it. Yeah. You could be making your Nevada quilt be neon colors, right? And that's fantastic too. Would definitely apply, right? As we begin to add our tangles on top of these colored fabrics that we're creating, to create that print on our fabric, all of this kind of inconsistent color will help to provide, those shades, those shading and the variation of highlights and lowlights within that tangled space. All right. So now I'm going to go ahead and go to these diagonal rays. And I'm going to use my 451, that light blue color for this. So I'm going to make sure that my blender is clean of my yellow. and lay another palette. And this time it's going to be this real light blue. And I'm going to use this light blue in these diagonal spaces right up to the corner of our frame here. Again, I'm not being real particular or fussy about how this color is coming to be. I'm appreciating the variation of an inconsistency of how this color is laying down. And I know that this is just part of the process. If there's any other sections that you'd like to go ahead and add a deeper color to, or kind of try to give a bit more variation, now's a great time to go ahead and do that. I'm gonna do that on mine as well, because it's never too late, even after you do your tangling. Um, well, depending on your ink that you're using, but I'll be using the microns, and the Tombos work really well. They are waterproof, but sometimes, depending on the paper you're using or the medium you're using, you get a little bit of a surprise blend or fuzzing of those crisp lines. So I do know in testing that the Tombos and the microns work well together. So you're never done. After you tangle, you can always go ahead and add a bit more as well. So now I'm going to go into that 526, that darker blue color, and I'm going to lay a little palette down, and I'm going to go into those squares in the center and add that darker blue into that center square. If you'd like to kind of make your diagonal lines just a bit darker or add a different tone into those diagonal lines, you can always go ahead and extend some of that darker blue out into those diagonals to kind of, again, offer that texture of depth. I don't want to completely fill that space, but kind of digging that darker variation that's kind of happening inside of that space. And so all we have left are these triangular spaces, and that's where I'm going to put my 977. So this kind of earthy brown, making sure that your blue is cleaned off of your blender. Coming in and adding that desert color, right? I'm going through these 50 State ZenQuiltz. I'm trying to find colors that kind of speak to me as far as the state, but also, again, as I mentioned, have some kind of tie-in, some kind of commonality, so that the series, when we're all done with 50, and I'm going to be putting mine into a 20 by 40 frame, uh, when I quote unquote sew them all together into one big quilt, when I take these quilt blocks and turn them into the large quilt, I want them to have some kind of cohesiveness, some kind of commonality that draws each piece into each other to make it make sense. Yeah, so they're all going to be unique individual pieces of fabric with those tangles that um, hopefully in some way I can correspond or correlate to something within that state. Um, so that each fabric was deliberately and intentionally chosen, no different than the tangling that we use to create each piece of fabric, right? So I'd like for it to be, yes, of course, Zentangle Inspired. We're offering color, we're offering measurements, we're offering the structure of a quilt, not just free flowing. We have a vision in mind, but I would love for it to be visually inspiring for each state as well, so that you notice the thought that was put into each quilt. It's not just a quilt, it's a state quilt that represents a particular state, right? All right. So we have our fabric colors laid out now, and the border, instead of blending, I'm going to go right to my color choices. Go right with the marker to the tile. So I'm going to use my 991 in each corner, those little corner triangles that came together by those overlapping edges or borders. And then I'm going to use that 526, that darker blue. And I'm going to use that again, just directly on that tile. And I want to make sure that the marker is kind of going over the edge of my tile as well, so that I don't have that white deckled edge showing when I piece each one of these blocks together. I want them to be really crisp and part of the fabric. I want this, your fabric wraps around, right? It's all one color. There's no hollow core to fabric, meaning the color's not just on the top, it's all the way through the material, right? So there we have it, the fabric colors of our Nevada quilt. So what tangles are appropriate for Nevada? Well, I chose desert flower for this cross intersection. So I'm going to start with my light gray, and I'm going to begin adding my desert flower into that space. And I'm going to look first at the whole, um, that whole channel, not the one that's divided in half, but that whole piece. And I'm going to start right in the center with my flower. Okay, so Nevada, I'm sorry. I've been rehearsing. I think it's a Pennsylvania thing. I'm not sure. But it starts with an orb, and I get corrected all of the time. I have to say it wrong to get it right. I do apologize. So once we have this center orb, we're going to make loops all the way around this very basic flower structure. Just thin loops all the way around. My marker isn't completely dry, so you'll see a little blooming of my ink on the marker. I'm okay with that, but if you want to just pause and wait for your tile to dry, by all means, just go ahead and pause me and come back when you're ready. Okay. And then I'm going to go ahead and add a second layer of those petals. Now, a lot of times when we're laying layers to flowers, we want to focus on the valley. We want to kind of offset and grow into the valley. Desert flower isn't like that. It's just another layer of these thin loops, and wherever they fall, they fall. So it's not about offsetting and only doing a petal within that valley. You're just continuing to go all the way around as it falls. And once we have that center flower completed, we're going to grow these, I'm going to call them vines. And the vines are just going to be various lines that kind of split off and grow in different directions. And I'm going to use my go behind. So I'm going to view that center channel as one space. So I'm not going to continue to grow into the fabric on either side, but rather use my go behind and create another vine just within this channel. Okay. So I'm going to pause right there because I want my fabric to have, let's call it a repeating pattern. Okay. So I'm going to pause so that I can add more on the either side of that. And on the ends of each one of these vines, we're going to do this 3-petal extension. So just loop, loop, loop. And if you want to add more shorter loops to fill in that space, you can do that as well. So you're just going to add these 3-petaled flowers on the ends of each one of those vines. Using your go behind, adding another extension if you want to fill in the space a bit more. So I'm going to call that particular um, expression complete, and I'm going to move to either side. And this time I'm going to offset and have those original center flowers kind of go off the side. So I'm going to use my go behind, and this fabric was cut right in the center of that large flower. Adding those loops all the way around. Again, I'm using that go behind. Adding that extension behind. And then you have those vines or shoots that come off that larger flower. Adding those 3-petaled or 3-looped extensions on the ends of those vines. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. And this time I'm going to have it go off the opposite edge. So I'm turned my tile. So I have this one going off the top. So I'm going to come back down to the bottom and add another beginner flower. Again, cut off when we created our strip of material for this center plus sign of this quilt. Adding that second layer, and then again, those extensions. So there we have desert flower. So this band is the same material. So I'm going to go ahead, turn my tile, and just start adding some more expressions into those spaces. You can add as many big flowers to kickstart that desert flower as you see it. Or you could go right to the vines and forget having that center flower at all, right? What can you see on your material? Don't try to put too much thought into this. Just put your pen down and add a vine or add a petal, or put your pen down and add that central flower wherever you see it, right? Don't think about it. Just allow the process to unfold naturally. You want to try to avoid that left brain, that decision making as much as we possibly can, right? Just enjoy the process, flow with our creativity. Once we know the patterns, we can just flow wherever our creativity and pen takes us. Think that you're done adding your desert flower. Change that perspective. Is there any space that jumps out at you as needing or requesting maybe another little extension flower or another little vine? Yeah. Don't think about it. Just allow your tile to speak to you and follow its voice. Okay. So there we have it. Desert flower. So we're going to head into these boxes, the center boxes that we've laid our darker blue into. And I realized that after changing my perspective, I would probably be going back in and making these boxes just a little bit darker so that there's a distinguishing factor between those two pieces of material. But I'm going to be adding Showgirl into those spaces. So Showgirl is a very large tangle that kind of grows upon itself from a center orb. So we're not going to see much of the tangle that we're using, but I couldn't resist using Showgirl in Nevada, right? So here is where we're going to start. I'm going to add an orb right into the bottom corner of that box. And from that bottom orb, I'm going to take a flux that wraps to the other side of the box. Now I'm going to try to avoid going over this material, right? Because this material is cut and this material is cut, right? So there would be no overlapping of the lines if this was cut material, right? So once we have that flux that wraps right over that center orb, I'm going to add another flux that kind of grows on top of that and grows on top and extends just beyond that top. All right. So now you may see just a little space where that second flux wraps over top of that first flux and would have another row starting that wraps again. Okay. Same thing here. On the other side, we would have the rounded part of the flux that's coming off from the right. Okay, so I'm going to do that again. I'm going to grow off the center and wrap around the front. So growing ever so slightly and wrapping in the process. Adding another line to the left of that for the next wrap that would go behind. Okay. And over here, we have the bulb part of the flux that's meeting into that space. Okay. Here I go. I'm going to wrap one more time. I'm going to take it up to the top, wherever that takes me. Okay. Adding the elements that are coming from the other side. So here's our main focus, this wrap right here. Again, each wrap would wrap, each flux line would wrap around that center orb, and they would all kind of lay on top and wrap around each other onto that orb, okay? So we're not seeing much of it, but we know that that tangle in the center is called Showgirl, and it is a necessary tangle to meet us in Nevada. So starting with just a couple of those first fluxes off that center orb. And when you get to the point where you're seeing what's happening on either side, you just want to go ahead and add those what can you see portions of that tangle. So there we have it, our Showgirl front and center for our Nevada quilt. Okay, so we have these arms that we're headed to next. And in these arms or these diagonal channels, I'm going to add the Tangle Oasis. Oasis is, think of kindergarten goldfish is where we're going to start. Okay. So we have this center line. So we're going to have a top row. Then we're going to turn our tile and we're going to have a mirrored row on top of that. Okay. So I'm going to ignore this little section back here and I'll fill that in after we kind of see where we're headed with this. So Oasis begins with a loop. And again, kindergarten goldfish, the loop closes pretty tightly at the bottom. We don't have a great big tail on these fish. We want to keep them pretty tight. Okay. So once we have one fish, we're going to flip the fish. So we're going to add another fish in the opposite direction. And we're going to continue to flip those fish along that whole channel. So once you're completed flipping that fish across the channel, we have two sections that are cut off, right? Not complete fish will fit. So you're only going to draw, of course, you're using your go behind what you can see. So here would be an upside down fish. And you may see the loop of the next fish on top, depending on how that has fallen for you. Okay. And here we would have an upside down fish. Okay. So I'm going to do that in each channel. Just doing that top channel, right side up fish, upside down fish. Being mindful, trying to keep the loops similar in size and the spacing kind of similar. Check in on those shoulders as you tangle. Enjoy the repetition. This is that Zentangle magic that happens where we find that zone. So now that we have our tops done in each one of those channels, I'm going to turn my tile and I'm going to start in the center. And what I want to do is mirror. So if I have what's now a down, because I've turned my tile, if I have a down, I want to take those tails and do an up. So ups should become downs and downs should become ups, and they should all connect with their respective other side. So you want to do that for each channel. Tails are connecting, heads are connecting. Breathe, offer yourself that breath. All right. Now, to complete our oasis, we're going to take those tails and connect them to the loop that's aside of them. Okay. So we're just going to extend the tail and land on the loop, both forward and backward. Now we have our pencil line kind of already defining this, right? So we're really just inking in that string line by connecting using these tails on either side. Okay. So now we have these fish that have been connected and they're kind of all looped together. And inside of these loops, inside of these spaces, there's a myriad of different things that you can do to enhance this tangle. So we're going to, or I am going to suggest that we kind of aura inside those loops and add a dark center. So just going to aura inside of each one of those loops and ink in that center. Ink in the whole center. You can not ink at all. You can add orbs in the center. You could add auras into the center. Possibilities really are only limited by what we see, right? What do you see happening in your little fish? Don't forget to blink. Once those fish all start swimming together, that means you need to just blink. It's okay. They'll still be there after your eyes open, right? We get so intent in our work as we're getting lost in our creative space that even the basics uh, are lost. Yeah. Offer yourself that breath. Check in on those shoulders. Where are your shoulders right now? So now I have just a little bit of space between each fish that I'm going to add I think just a single aura into that space, depending on how much space you have, you could um, add lots of individual auras into this place, into this space, and kind of create a bit more movement. But I think that based on how closely um, I've added my fish. I'm just going to do one right down the center. So I'm going to aura the heads of the fish. So this elongated S, always moving my elongated S with the direction of the heads of the fish. So just like we flipped our fish, so too are we going to be flipping that aura into that space. So I'm also redefining over my aura a bit to give it a much stronger voice. Again, if you had more space, you could just do light, thin little auras, filling that space with a different kind of movement, right? Again, there's so many variations to how this tangle unfolds. Truly, I don't believe there is any right or wrong. Whatever you fit into those spaces is absolutely beautiful. So there we have Oasis. How beautiful. All right. So I keep looking at this and I'm going to go back and try to add some more depth to that center with my dark blue marker, just so that you can see, if you are following along, um, the difference in that, the depth of that. I don't want to sell it short. Just want to make sure that my brown is off. It's also a good way to see how you can layer your color right on top of your microns as well. And depending on the pen that you've chosen, you may want to do a little test on the back of your paper before you start adding more color into that space, just so that you're not disappointed by the outcome, meaning it bleeds or it kind of blossoms underneath your blender, right? So yeah, I'm liking that contrast much better. It was too similar, and I definitely wanted to show that there were two different kinds of materials in that space, right? Didn't want it to be flat. So that gave it just enough pop for that showgirl to have a completely different voice than that Oasis. So much happier with that. Wonderful. So I'm going to move now into those brown triangles. And I am going to add some neon into that space. So neon, I'm going to go from the corner of the triangle, kind of dividing that space. So I'm going to diagonal from the corner down to our oasis. And you have a ruler aside of you. I'm just going to go ahead and freehand this, allowing myself some grace, knowing that it is hand drawn. And I'm going to aura that diagonal line 3 times. And then I'm going to turn my tile and aura 3 times on the other side. So we have these lines coming from the diagonal to our oasis. And now the neon. I'm going to go ahead and from the corner of that triangle that exists now, I'm going to zigzag back and forth, or I guess more wiggle back and forth to connect to those lines. And I'm going to do that from each corner. So we have this wiggle coming from either corner or each side of the triangle, meeting these arid lines on that diagonal. That's neon. So I'm going to do that in each triangular space, auraing either side of that center diagonal 3 times. So in this quilt, we have some desert flower. We have some showgirl, oasis, and now neon. Is that perfect for Nevada as we build the fabric of our quilt? Yeah. Take your time, enjoy the process. Okay, so we're all tangled up. Our Nevada quilt is right now just looking like a Zentangle inspired art piece, which it is, but we need to quilt these pieces together. Yeah. So that's where our dark gray comes into play. So we're going to go ahead and stitch each one of these individual pieces together to the next piece. Now, this oasis, as we go through this process, when we drew it, we drew two channels of fabric. It's your choice if this now represents one thick piece of fabric, or if you want to stitch up the center and divide that into two pieces. So here we go, stitching to add these pieces together. Again, I've changed my pen to the dark gray, the number 44. And this short, staccato, deliberate, intentional pen stroke, working your way around. So we're pen stitching. Each one of these lines would be a stitch of thread if we were working on a quilt frame, right? So each piece is an individual unit to the block as a whole. So the blocks are sewn together, and then the blocks, or excuse me, the patches are sewn together to create the blocks. And then the blocks are sewn together to create the quilt. Take your time, be deliberate and intentional with this process so that you don't get little tails on the end of your stitches, right? You want these clean, crisp, intentional little dashed lines. Each shape is its own patch or piece of material. So the sew line or the thread goes on either side of each one of those elements, right? So you see that I chose to sew both portions of those center diagonal pieces instead of making it one unit. Just a choice. No right or wrong. Offer yourself a breath. Your body thanks you. I'm going to go ahead and sew that border too. But as I sew the large, in this case, blue section, I'm only going to sew the top for the moment. And I'm going to just wait and see how I piece these together. And I'll probably end up sewing them once I get them into place in my frame. So for the moment, I'm just going to stitch across the top of each one of those sections. Okay. So we're all stitched up. When you think that you are done, go ahead and change that perspective. Yeah. If you've not stitched one of your sections, it will jump out at you, right? So just go ahead, hold that tile out at arm's length. I think about now you could be oohing and eyeing, but we do have some shading still to do. So we're going to go to our colored pencils, and I don't want to bring graphite in. I don't want to bring that deep dark shading in. What I want to do is kind of offer much the same colors as I'm using, and kind of tone them down subtly. So what my goal is, and I'm not going to be focusing on the tangles themselves, I'm going to be focusing on the patches, those sewn pieces that every time you offer that sewing, you're going to get that puckering, which kind of poofs up that center section. So right around the pucker or the sewing, we're going to have a bit more depth or a bit more shading than we do right in the center. So that's how I'm going to approach this. Again, this is Zentangle, and there is no right or wrong as to how you see this shading happening. So again, I'm going to focus on the whole patch as a whole. So I'm going to bring that yellow right into the edge in a circular motion. I don't want any hard edges, just a circular motion right around the edge of that sewing, just to offer, again, that depth or that shading that occurs right at the pucker of that sewing. So you'll see the variation, the gradation that I was talking about using the blender instead of having that marker go directly to our tile. We now have a gradation inside of where we're adding that shading, again using a similar, much the same color as our marker, but we still have that texture, that variation on the inside, adding that depth. So I'm going to go to that blue, center blue section. Again, I have my 105 in my hand, that similar color, and I'm going to try to stay away from the center and only focus right on the edge of that block. It's a little bit of a small area, so I don't want to take away that highlight right in the center, but I do want to offer that depth right around that sewn edge. So I gave a little bit more pressure to my pencil for those center blocks, but I'm going to use the same pencil in my diagonal channels as well. So I'm going to lighten up on that pressure, circular motion, sewing, that puckering is what I want to focus on. And this can be as subtle or as dramatic as you want your shading to be, right? You can always add more, not so easily taken away, right? So just if you're not real comfortable doing your shading in colored pencils, by all means, you can tiptoe, right? Baby steps, and just kind of play with the layering of it, just to kind of introduce yourself to how that really works. And if you're completely uncomfortable, go ahead and grab that graphite and offer the shading as you're comfortable with the tools that you choose, right? Sometimes it's good to play and explore. If it's new, you can always press play and do it again if you don't like it. And sometimes it's just great to stick with what we know and can embrace the outcome without too many surprises, right? All right, so I'm going to call my blue done, and now I'm going to go to my brown. So that brown, same technique, just focusing right around that edge. Circular motion. I don't want any hard lines happening. I just want that subtle depth, that shadow at the pucker. Now we can, ooh, ah. There's our Nevada quilt for our 50 States series. This is Sheila Grube. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. Whether you're choosing to do just your state that you live in, the states that you've traveled to, or the entire series with me, I appreciate you. Sign your masterpiece, offer yourself gratitude and appreciation. And until next time, thank you so much.